Good evening. Welcome to Detroit Public Library's author series. Tonight we're hosting Howard Husock. Am I pronouncing that right, Howard?
It's Husock, but everybody gets it wrong.
Okay, Howard Husock. He is a senior fellow in the Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on municipal government, urban housing policy, civil society, and philanthropy. We are here to discuss his new book, The Poor Side of Town and Why We Need It. And he is in conversation with Jamon Jordan, who is an educator, writer, and historian, and has been a researcher of African and African-American history for more than 20 years. Mr. Jordan is the founder and CEO of Black Scroll Network, History and Tours in Detroit, where he leads tours and presentations on African and African-American history. And we're just going to go ahead and get started with the conversation between these two gentlemen this evening. Thank you.
Well, I don't know who's supposed to start, but I'm just really glad to be here with Jamon. He was extremely helpful in helping me with my book, The Poor Side of Town, in helping me to understand the history of Black Bottom in Detroit, which to me epitomizes just about everything we've gotten wrong in American housing policy and continue to get wrong. So that's why I focus on it in the book. And I had such a great guide in Jamon.
Thank you, Howard. And I'm really, I really appreciate that. And of course, I appreciate the work that you put into this book. For a long time, this history of housing policies and what has happened with the areas for lower income working class people throughout many cities in the United States. For a long time, that history has not been known or has been people have forgotten this history. And so it's always great that this history is starting to come out. There are a number of people who are starting to talk about this history. And so people are becoming more knowledgeable about this time period of housing policies, both city and state policy and federal policy on housing.
That's right.
And so if you can tell us a little bit about what brought you to this topic.
Well, you know, I just think poor neighborhoods shouldn't be bad neighborhoods, and that we've denigrated historically working class and minority neighborhoods as being slums. When if you look at Bronzeville in Chicago, DeSoto Carr in St. Louis, and Black Bottom in Detroit, these were areas of concentrated Black-owned businesses, Black property ownership, Black-owned rental property, and it was all cleared, demolished, swept away because it was a so-called slum. It was a perfect storm of bad policy. First of all, and you know this better than anybody else in the world, you had racism. So you had the race riot in Detroit in 1943, which was blamed on Black people, even though it wasn't Black people's fault, right? And which allowed Mayor Cobo, formerly of Cobo Hall, does that still stand?
So the building is still there, but it's no longer named after Cobo Hall. Well, that's no longer named after Mayor Albert Cobo.
Well, that's a good thing, because he blamed Black people for the race riot, and he was determined to demolish Black Bottom and get rid of that eyesore, as he would have thought of it. But he never would have been able to do that. It was too expensive. Mm-hmm. You had a lot of white people own property there too. But right. Along came the National Housing Act of 1949 and urban renewal. And suddenly Detroit was flush with urban renewal money to get rid of slums and replace it with safe and sanitary housing. Who could be opposed to that? Well, maybe the people who owned 325 Black-owned businesses that got nothing.
Wow.
Right? Maybe it was the owners of Henry's Swing Club, where John Lee Hooker used to drop in there tonight, as he put it, in Boogie Chillin', right? Maybe it was all of the churches, New Bethel AME, where C.L. Franklin preached, demolished. Aretha Franklin had it right in Why I Sing the Blues, Negro removal, she called it. She had it right. And it was federal money that made that possible. Why was that federal money there? Because you had the racists on the Cobo side, and then you had the progressives on the Eleanor Roosevelt side. They thought they were doing poor people a favor by tearing down their neighborhoods and replacing them with high-rise public housing, where guess what? Nobody can own anything.
That's right.
So as you taught me, Jamon, white people are moving to the suburbs with FHA loans, and Black people are being moved into segregated housing projects where you can't own anything because nobody can own anything. The government owns it.
Yes, that's right. So, so as you're, and I mean you're really telling a history that a lot of people, even in the city of Detroit, don't know. But there are other places, as you're talking about. You're talking about Brownsville, and you're talking about other places. Tell us some of the stories of other places, of what you found when you researched other places in the country besides Detroit. We're going to come back to Black Bottom, of course, but tell us about other places, things that you learned about other places that you didn't already know.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. You can dive into, if you're a crazy policy wonk like me, you can dive into old census records and find out who lived in places, who owned property, who rented property, all kinds of good information. So if you look at Chicago, I looked at all the areas that were torn down to build public housing, right? And a lot of these areas were African-American neighborhoods, a lot of them.
That's right. That's right.
Not only, by the way, there were poor white neighborhoods that were torn down too.
That's exactly right.
Right, but in Chicago, in the predominantly Black census tracts that were torn down for public housing, 16% of the housing was owner occupied. And then beyond that, you had a large number of owner present houses. So if you had a 2-family, that means the landlord was living there. He was a small guy too. If you had a 3-family, the same thing. In Cleveland, 32% of the areas were torn down for public housing, owner occupied. Detroit, you know that, 37%. In St. Louis, 39%, right? Here's what happened in St. Louis. It's the most amazing story. So you had this area called DeSoto, Carr, and Mill Valley. They had big factories there. People are working there. You know, you had important institutions there, torn down and replaced by the worst public housing project of all time. 11 high rises called Pruitt-Igoe. In 1954, the ribbon was cut. In 1971, we're talking about less than 20 years later, it was imploded. It was so uninhabitable. So all that property, look, were there some people that had privies out back? Yeah, there were. Were there some people that shared bathrooms? Yeah, there were. But there were plenty of people who had nice homes, right? And it's not only that they didn't get compensated or were minimally compensated, the potential appreciation of that property was denied to them. And that's so true in Detroit, because in 1950, when Black Bottom is getting cleared, right? Detroit's about to go into its boom years. All that property appreciation was denied to those owners. And just, can you imagine, Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, again, the worst of the worst, was designed by a Japanese architect by Yamasaki. He got the Architect of the Year award. He also designed, are you ready for this? The World Trade Center.
The World Trade Center, yes. And he was based in Detroit, and he designed a number of buildings right here in the city of Detroit, some of which still stand. That's right.
Yeah. And Mies van der Rohe designed Lafayette Park.
That's right.
So these modernist replacement projects, people built their own little homes. They had their own relationships. They had their own churches. They had the Urban League. They had the Phyllis Wheatley Home for colored ladies, elderly colored ladies.
That's right.
They took it all to a wrecking ball.
Yes. So you what you're telling us is this very important history, but of course, this very painful history as well. So it's very important, very powerful history. We ought to know it, but it's very painful also when we talk about this history. And of course, Black Bottom in the city of Detroit has been going through, maybe for the last decade or so, has been going through a revival, at least in the consciousness of people. So not that they're recreating Black Bottom, but that people are learning about Black Bottom. Some people for the first time, and some people who had long forgotten about it are beginning to remember the stories their mothers, their grandmothers, their grandfathers, their uncles had told them about Black Bottom. So your book is adding to an already growing body of work talking about this history in the city of Detroit. There's been historians.
Coleman Young grew up in Black Bottom.
That's right. Coleman Young did. That's right. And so historians like Ken Coleman and Sharon Sexton here in the city of Detroit, they've been talking about Black Bottom for a long time. And of course, I've been talking and writing about Black Bottom as well. But there's a Black Bottom Street View project. I'm not sure if you know about it, but there's a Street View project which was created by an architect, architectural professor, Emily Kudo. She created the Black Bottom Street View project using photographs of Black Bottom, the pictures that were taken when they were planning to destroy it. And she's recreated the streets. She's put them up on posts. And so you can walk down the streets of Black Bottom, which are been recreated by the photographs of Black Bottom. And so you're walking through the streets. She's done that. And now she's partnered with the Black Bottom Archives, which have identified people in other places in Black Bottom so that you can do it on a map or virtually. You can go on their website and find out where people lived and where churches were, where businesses were, where different institutions were in Black Bottom. And just this July, I mean, you may not be aware of this, just a couple of months ago, the Black Bottom historical marker went up, and that's it behind me. So that background that I have behind me is the Black Bottom historical marker, which went up in July of this year. And
no, I did see that, and I wrote about it.
Okay.
Congratulations on that. It's a great, but it's important the history is so painful and in such a deep way, because this idea that, Black people were helpless. They came to Detroit and they were living in degradation, and then white people had to save them with public housing. That is not the right story.
That's right.
Black people came to Detroit, started their own institutions, built their own housing, referred people to jobs, boycotted white businesses that wouldn't hire Black people.
That's right.
They were self-reliant, independent, and all the things that white conservatives, and some people call me a white conservative, criticize the Black community for.
Right.
Black Bottom had it. It had entrepreneurship. It had religiosity. It had everything.
All the things that we applaud today when we talk about the immigrant story.
That's right.
This is really what African-American communities looked like during the Great Migration. They really created what is normally applauded when we talk about immigrants, people coming from Ireland. They had things rough. Things were really tough for them. They worked real hard. They started their own businesses, opened up their own churches, began to move up, began to pull up their fellow immigrants up with them. All the kinds of stories that we applaud when we're talking about immigrants, especially immigrants from Europe.
Right.
We applaud these things. African Americans were doing these things, and they were considered, like you said, slums.
Right, and to me, it is the immigrant story. It's as if it's compared to Mississippi, Alabama, Detroit might as well have been a different country.
Yeah, that's right.
It was rural versus urban. It was
that's right.
The most, was there segregation in Detroit? Yes, but it was the deepest Jim Crow versus somewhat less Jim Crow.
Right.
It was a new country, and Black people were moving up and out. And then that process, to my way of thinking, was interrupted by good intentions that went awry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you had, like you said earlier, there's two sides that are happening that converge. The progressive side is we're going to build these federally funded public housing for these poor Black people who, without us, they'd be suffering.
Yeah.
And that's the one end. And then on the conservative end is these are slums and they need to be wiped out. And we need to keep them away from the core of the city. We need to keep them away from the downtown area. So we need to remove this slum. We're going to clear this slum and have urban renewal. So you have both sides.
It's a threat.
That's right. And they call African Americans even moving into neighborhoods at that time. Kobo is referring to them as invasions. They're invasions of wholesome communities, wholesome neighborhoods. He doesn't even care if they're middle class African Americans. He's calling them, and others are calling them invasions when Black people move into neighborhoods. So this is this history, and this is what you wrote about in The Poor Side of Town. And this is really adding to us having a better understanding of not that things just happened, but that there were policies that were created.
That's right.
And so the fact that Black Bottom no longer exists, the fact that Brownsville is nothing like it was, the fact that the Pruitt-Igoe Towers took over what was a prosperous, or at least a working class, stable working class community that was on its way up, that would have been progressing. All of that was stunted, not by the people themselves just doing bad things, but by policy, by government policy, sometimes local, but partnering with federal policy. And what do people say when you point to the fact that it was policy that changed these communities rather than the inadequacies of the people who were residents there?
Well, I think a lot of people think that these quote unquote slums, and let's be clear, these are not fancy neighborhoods, man. There were privies out back, you know, in the Lower East Side of New York, there were public baths. Otherwise you didn't get a shower. That's a real thing, right? But it's not forever. That's the thing
right.
that people forget. What people say to me is, well, slumlords own these things. They were being exploited, right? And I think that the research that I've done, the numbers that I show about owner presence and property ownership belies that. But I think that's the story that people has been so bred into them, you know, going all the way back to Jacob Riis and his landmark book, How the Other Half Lived in New York. And what's really interesting about that book is he never asked the people in the Lower East Side, how do they feel about the Lower East Side? He just takes these pictures designed to shock the conscience of middle-class people living uptown and say, isn't this terrible? Well, yeah, maybe you don't want to live there, but ask them. Would they rather live in rural Europe where they have no running water? Well, no, they were happy to be in New York. Black people were happy to be in Detroit versus sharecropping, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so of course, as you clearly understand that African Americans, as they're leaving the South during the Great Migration, as they're leaving the South, they're running to job opportunities. They're running to opportunities for upward mobility. The factories in many of the cities that they're moving to are really hiring African Americans and paying them a living wage. In Detroit, it's the auto industry really that's doing that. But in Chicago, it's the trains, it's the meat packing industry, right, and it's other industries going on in other places. But so they're leaving sharecropping and tenant farming and other low skill, low pay or no pay labor in the South, but they're also leaving terrorism. They're leaving lynching. Absolutely. They're leaving the brutality that's going on, the brutal form of enforcing Jim Crow that is occurring in the South, where every day there's a lynching somewhere in a Southern state, and Black people can't vote. They can't register to vote. So this is what they're leaving and coming to places like Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and of course, Detroit. So they're leaving that extreme form of Jim Crow and coming to places that in the North that have their own versions of Jim Crow, but it's not the level of violence against African Americans that is going on in Mississippi and in Alabama, in Louisiana, and Georgia. And so, and they're being paid a living wage. They're being able to move up in income, which would be almost impossible as a sharecropper or a tenant farmer.
Right, let's face it, slavery continued another 100 years after the Civil War.
Right.
They called it sharecropping, but you were essentially a serf. And the white landowners even used that term, serf. Mm-hmm. So this was a profound escape. And so the idea that Black Bottom was somehow degradation because, you know, middle-class white people wouldn't want to live there, nobody was telling them to live there,
Mhm.
you know, but it needed to be appreciated and needs to be celebrated. But we also have to be careful, in my opinion, not to make the same mistakes,
Mhm.
right? So the idea that, you know, poor people of any kind, certainly minority poor people, can only thrive if somehow they get to move to a subsidized housing project in the suburbs. I
Mhm.
reject that too. You may
Mhm.
disagree with this, but I believe that every neighborhood should be made a good neighborhood. Whether you're in a poor neighborhood, poor neighborhoods today in Detroit, why aren't the schools good? I understand there's problems. Why aren't the parks good? Why aren't the streets safe? Every neighborhood should be a so-called high opportunity zone. We shouldn't have to think about abandoning neighborhoods in which any one group is the dominant group to move to another neighborhood because otherwise I have no opportunity. That was
Right.
the same theory, and that is wrong and it's patronizing.
Right. Right. So let's talk about some of the people that you bring up in your book. That we've heard these names, but many people don't know really much about these people. So, for instance, we know that there's these places called Levittown, but most of us don't know anything about William Levitt. Can you tell us a little bit about William Levitt and a little bit about that story?
Yeah, it's a very mixed story in a lot of ways. It's a triumph and a tragedy at the same time. And so when I talk about the poor side of town, I'm talking about what I call naturally occurring affordable housing. We flounder around. How do we create affordable housing? Well, William Levitt knew how to do it. He was a housing developer in New York. And he said, I get it. Small houses on small lots. That way I can build a lot and I can spread my costs out and people can buy the houses. These were the places where people moved from the cities after World War II. And there were versions of Levittown in a lot of places, Skokie in Illinois. I don't know what the Detroit equivalent is, you know, inner ring suburbs. His houses were 750 square feet and they had no basements,
Wow.
right? So they were the new slums, but people lined up and slept out overnight to get in line to buy them,
Mhm.
right? And they were the breakthrough. They showed how you can create affordable housing when the progressives who were behind public housing believed private builders couldn't do it.
Mhm.
Well, he proved you could do it. Now, here's the tragedy. He had deed restrictions that barred Black people.
Mhm.
You know, he made a terrible, terrible miscalculation. His calculation was the same calculation that the Federal Housing Administration made, which was if white people live in a neighborhood, they don't want any Black people living there. Otherwise, the property values will go down. My view is quite totally opposite. They want people who are similar to them socioeconomically.
Mhm.
So if somebody can afford that house in Levittown, Black or white, they would have been accepted. They would have been accepted. It would have been a breakthrough in American life in what we used to talk about racial integration. We don't talk about that anymore, but we should,
Mhm.
because it's the ticket to housing wealth accumulation, in my opinion. But he was convinced the Black people were going to drive the white people away, so he made that terrible mistake. In my opinion, demand was so pent up. White people were not going to say, well, I can't live next to you because you're Black. Wait a minute. You were a GI too. You qualify for a VA loan too. We're okay here. We're okay. But he made that tragic mistake. And it was,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, go ahead, finish.
Well, and it wasn't until deed restrictions were dropped, not until the early 50s, that began to change. And ultimately, it took the 1968 Fair Housing Act to sweep all of that away. And we never should lose sight of enforcing that. Whatever you can afford to buy in this country, you should be able to buy or rent.
Yeah, one of the things that makes the Levittown, besides the fact of the racial restrictions, one of the things that makes it successful is the fact that people are going to be owners. That's the
Exactly.
thing. So even though it's a small house, even though it's not a lot of square footage, it doesn't have a basement. You don't have a bunch of land that you own. The fact that you are no longer going to be a renter, you're going to own your own house. You're going to be able to use that home to create equity and be able to move at some point maybe out of that little small house into a bigger house, because you're going to use the equity in that home once you own it to maybe open up a store or a restaurant. This is the number one way of building wealth in this country historically, has been owning property. So
Right.
It has not been someone like a Henry Ford. That has not been how most people moved up in wealth in America, because they started a company that just took off. It has not been because they could play basketball or football, or they could act or sing well. That is how most people moved up in wealth in this country. Most people have been able to have upward mobility in the United States because of their ownership of some level of property. And home ownership is one of the main forms of property ownership. And so Levitt's plan makes sense because it allows people to own property. While public housing, after 20, 30 years, the only thing you have are rent receipts at the Brewsters or the Pruitt-Igoe. You can't have 20 years of rent receipts from the Pruitt-Igoe towers because they only lasted 17 years. But Cabrini Green or the Robert Taylor homes or the Marcy projects in Brooklyn or Jordan Downs and Watts, if you're any of these federally funded housing projects, Techwood in Atlanta, if you're any of these federally funded housing projects throughout the country, you are only paying rent. You will never own anything. And so you might be a working class person working alongside another working class person, and you guys are making the same income. But if that other working class person who you work alongside buys a home, 20 years later, 99% of the time, he's going to have moved up in wealth. You who are paying rent will have stagnated or even gone down in wealth.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I'm glad you put that spin on it. I felt kind of constrained to make the case about the racial covenants.
Yeah.
But you're right about Levitt's insight and why his marketing was so successful. So to me, this immigrant story of the Great Migration is tragically interrupted, and the ownership path that was available to white ethnic groups was denied to Black people, in my opinion, by liberal housing policy, right? By racism too, because of FHA. So it was a double whammy. FHA is saying, no, you can't get a mortgage because you're going to move into a neighborhood on the wrong side of the red line. You're on this side. And then we got some else for you. We have a housing project for you. So you should be happy with that. And we should not be surprised that leads us to our present predicament of the great disparity between Black and white wealth accumulation.
That is exactly right. So, I mean, what you just really encapsulated what we see as a major part of the wealth inequity or the wealth gap that exists today. Of course, there was a wealth gap post-slavery. So after slavery ended, of course, there are some people who own land and some people who were property formerly, and now they're free, but they don't have any wealth. So yes, you already had a wealth gap, but you see this increase of a wealth gap and this growth of a whole new form of wealth with these housing policies. So like you said earlier, and I really agree with you. I may not put it the same way that you would put it, but I would I agree with you in the sense that the government is really more behind this inequity than the folks themselves. So yes, there were racial restrictive covenants prior to the federal government 1934 Housing Act. So before that, there were people who put in their deed, this home cannot be rented, leased, or sold to a Negro. Or
and to Hebrews, by the way.
And to Jewish people. These were the two main groups, although there in some places there were even other groups who were added. But those were the two main groups, Black folks and Jewish people. Can't rent, sell, lease to them. You can't, they can't live there either. They can't even reside in these homes. So these were on racial restrictive covenants. However, those racial restrictive covenants, what we find over and over, whether you're looking at New York, or you're looking at Cleveland, Chicago, of course, if you're looking at Detroit, you find people violating them over and over money.
Money talks.
So you find people who are more capitalist than they are racist. And so even though it's written in the deed, if a Black person offers a little bit more money than a white home buyer, these people are willing to violate the racial restrictive covenant and sell it to a Black person or to a Jewish person or someone else who's on that racial restrictive covenant. They're willing to violate them if people pay more money. That happened in the city of Detroit with Dr. Ocean Sweet. That's how he got the home at 2905 Garland in 1925. He paid more than what the white home buyers were willing to pay.
Right. It's unfortunate that he had to be twice as good, but it did work for him.
Yep. And so that's how, so you always had that. But when the federal government gets involved in housing, then money isn't a factor. Money won't buy you past the FHA's policies. So paying a little bit more, the government is still blocking you from moving into that neighborhood. And so that I would argue in agreement with you that the federal government discriminated in housing more than any other institution in America's history.
Yeah, Senator Edward Brooke, who was the first Black senator post-Reconstruction, a Republican from Massachusetts, said, everything the government touches turns to segregation.
Right, and so that's what we have when we're talking about the FHA's policies in 1934, all the way up until the Fair Housing Act is passed in 1968. That's what we have there. And then that's also what we have with the building of all these housing projects, these federally funded housing projects. We have the federal government's housing answer, which is really the shortest way of putting it is the federal government picked winners and losers. And so they gave all kinds of benefits to one group of people so they could move up by becoming homeowners, and they blocked another group of people from using that same avenue so that they could move up and become homeowners. And they gave them another path.
In the guise of benevolence.
Right. That's exactly right. So you don't have a disagreement with me. You on, at least on this. The 1934 Housing Act, the 1937 Housing Act, the way the federal government, the way the Veterans Administration allowed the FHA to run the housing portion of the GI Bill, so African Americans would be blocked even though they went to war.
Right.
All of that is going on. And then it's the Fair Housing Act that makes this against the law. And the Fair Housing Act, it has a whole bunch of stuff in it. It's against what the real estate agents are doing. They're steering people to neighborhoods. They're using block busting techniques. So the Fair Housing Act says that all that's illegal. The Fair Housing Act is against what the banks are doing and the mortgage companies. They won't give honor mortgages for African Americans in certain neighborhoods. But more than anything, the Fair Housing Act is against what the federal government itself was doing.
That's true.
So the federal government outlawed itself with the Fair Housing Act of 1968 because they, more than any other of these other institutions, more than the real estate agents, more than the mortgage companies and the banks, more than the private homeowners who had the racial restrictive covenants in their deeds, more than any of those institutions, the federal government had been blocking African Americans from becoming homeowners.
Yeah, and you know, the search for the perfect public housing project just continued, and this destruction of Black neighborhoods didn't stop with Black Bottom. It went on and on and on.
Yeah, it went all over the country.
Yeah, and you have these rickety housing projects from the 70s that are now reaching the end of their useful life. The same thing, they're all predominantly minority. I mean, to have half of the 3 million people in public housing in this country be African American, that's crazy. Mm-hmm. That is way disproportionate.
The reason why, to this day, many people, when they view a single family homeowner,
right,
their view of that is a white person, probably in a suburb. And when people come up with their image of a person living in a housing project, they're probably, the image that comes to mind is an African American living in some inner city. But the reason why these are our images is because of federal policy, not because people just naturally steered, African Americans naturally steered themselves into housing projects, and white working class folks steered themselves into owning homes, the federal government created two roads for two groups of people. One road was home ownership, and the federal government paved that road for whites, working class whites. And another road was paved for African Americans, and it was housing projects and removal of their own neighborhoods, their own residential areas, which would be paid for by the 1949 Housing Act, which you referenced
and
earlier.
their businesses and their churches and their institutions.
That's right.
Which were totally unappreciated. That's right. And so that brings us to today. And so there's a natural tendency to think, well, we've got to then somehow, build new housing in the suburbs to make up for what we did. And I'm okay with that, but I don't think it should be this subsidized rental housing. I think that would repeat the same mistake. Your point about all you have is rent receipts after 20 years. So to me, we've got to go to Grosse Pointe and Bloomfield Hills and places like that, and not say, can we put up a high rise here so we can have poor Black people live there? They're going to say no to that in a heartbeat. But if you say, well, look, there's some undeveloped land here. Can we build some smaller houses here that might be starter homes for people, and that might have the effect of empowering a wide spectrum of people, including poor Black people, to move into your neighborhood? Maybe, and I don't take it as a given, and I don't discount racism. Maybe we have a chance to create new poor sides, or at least not as rich side parts of town, where people have a chance to move up and out of the city.
Yeah, and I mean, the reality of this, the federal government imposed, and city and states did too, imposed housing policies on communities that the communities didn't want. But they never imposed the kind that you're talking about now. So they didn't impose home ownership for African Americans. That wasn't one of the things they imposed. They tried to impose housing projects, which people didn't want. So a lot of neighborhoods said, no, we don't want a housing project here. We don't want a federally funded housing project. We don't want low income apartments here. We don't want high rise housing projects here. We don't want basically areas that are meant for people to stay poor in. We don't want those. So, but the federal government built them anyway, so they still got built, even though communities said no. So the Brewsters are still existing, and they're in Brush Park. And believe me, Brush Park didn't want it there when the Brewsters were being built in the 1930s. And the Brush Park, of course, was a wealthy community, and you have this housing project for poor African Americans being built there in the 1930s. It's one of the first federally funded housing projects in the country. So nobody wanted that then, but the federal government imposed it on the community. However, they could have just as easily imposed, like you said, small homes. They could have imposed that. The people still may have been against it, but the federal government could have still made it happen regardless of the people's stance.
Well, at the very least, the tactics and how you go about doing it, that's hard stuff. But at the very least, if that had happened, people would have not had more than rent receipts.
Yeah, that's right. So now there would be people who would be able to point back and say, this is how I started. I started with this small home over here in this neighborhood. I owned it, and then it moved up in value, and then I sold it at a profit. And I was able to open up my own business. People would be able to do that. And you can't say that with staying at the Brewsters, or staying at Cabrini Green, or staying at Robert Taylor Homes, or Pruitt-Igoe, or any of the other federal housing projects throughout the country, because you don't own anything. And so,
and then we blame the residents for the degradation there.
Right.
When nobody owns anything, the whole social fabric unravels.
Tell us a little bit about Jane Jacobs.
Okay.
Every year we have the Jane's Walk, and it's in cities throughout the country. There are people who do walk their neighborhoods and tell about the different places in the fabric of the neighborhood. They do tours. I used to lead a Jane's Walk tour in the city of Detroit, and it's named after Jane Jacobs, but a lot of people don't know anything about her. Can you tell us a little bit about Jane Jacobs?
Yeah. I met and corresponded with Jane Jacobs, so I actually knew her. And Jane Jacobs, I call her the unreformer. You know, if housing reform gave us public housing, she was the unreformer. She wrote a book called Death and Life of Great American Cities, in which she was the first one to call out urban renewal. Right? A lot of people know her because she stopped some highway projects, and she had this theory that if people are looking at the street, the neighborhood is safer, all of which, those are good things. But she called out urban renewal for wiping off the face of the country. Mixed use neighborhoods with stores and dispersed ownership. So there's a story in my book where she was a writer before she wrote this book, which, by the way, is included in the Modern Library 20th Century Classic Best 100 Books. So it's Death and Life of Great American Cities. It's still an important book. So when she was starting to do the writing for that for an architectural magazine, she went to Philadelphia and she met this big shot urban renewal guy there, Edwin Bacon, father of Kevin Bacon, the actor.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Only 1 degree of separation.
Yeah, only 1 degree there, right.
And he said, well, I'm going to take you to the bad neighborhoods. And she takes the bad neighborhoods, and there's people hanging out. Maybe some people are drinking wine. I don't know what's going on there, but they're bustling anyhow. And then he takes her to his replacement neighborhood, and it's all new buildings, cookie cutter, housing projects. And she says, oh, it's very interesting, Ed. Where are all the people? It had become this antiseptic thing where nobody owned anything. And that became her template. So she celebrates old buildings that get new uses. She called out urban renewal for what it did to Black Bottom, what it did in East Harlem. East Harlem, she counted up all the businesses that were wiped out by building public housing projects in East Harlem, which is the largest concentration still in the United States. And you know who they name them for? They always name them for famous Black people. James Weldon Johnson. He wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. And he has a public housing project named for him in New York. That's bad.
Yeah, in Detroit, we had the Brewsters were the first, but then the high rises, which were added to the Brewsters, were the Frederick Douglass housing projects.
Yeah.
And so it became the Brewster Douglass housing projects. And so you are correct. They do generally name them after some famous person in the African-American community.
Right.
So
the implicit assumption there is Black people will always live here and they'll always be poor.
right. Yeah, in Detroit in the 1940s, the Sojourner Truth housing projects were built in the 1940s. So yes, you are definitely pointing to a truism that we see in Detroit, but throughout the country. And then another person I want to ask about before, and you guys are going to have to tell me when you want to switch it over to questions. I just want to make sure that Christine, Stacy, you guys let me know because we'll just keep talking here. So I want to switch over.
We're having a good time, so you're going to
right.
call us
I want to switch it over at some point to the audience so we can hear or begin to try to respond to their questions or comments. But another person I want to hear about is Johnny Ray Youngblood, Reverend Johnny Ray Youngblood. If you could tell us a little bit about.
All right, so Johnny Ray Youngblood,
very interesting figure.
Yeah, he runs the East Brooklyn congregations in New York, and in the early 1990s, he had this idea. He wanted to do something to assist the Black family and to draw men back into the church. And one of the ways he thought to do that was to have home ownership possibilities in Brooklyn and the Bronx. That was a time in which New York's population was falling. There was large areas of vacant land. By the way, there's a lot of vacant land in Detroit today.
That's right.
So bring in Johnny Ray Youngblood. And so he had this idea. And there was this other crazy guy named I.D. Robbins. And for years, he'd had this idea that small houses that people own would be an alternative to public housing, and people would want it, and it would help them get out of the projects. And they met each other through an intermediary, and they partnered, and they started what are called the Nehemiah homes, named for the biblical prophet who rebuilt a city. And they collectively built thousands of small homes, single family and two family. And people literally, the largest group that moved into those homes were people out of public housing. People would, I have stories in the book about people who would go to see, while they were saving up and doubling up with their sister to save money, they would go see the muddy vacant lot where they knew their house was going to go up because they'd put a down payment down. People want their own little houses. And he himself had grown up, Johnny Ray Youngblood, in the lower ninth in New Orleans, in a shotgun shack with a mud floor basement. And he said, nobody kept that house cleaner than my mother. He got this. He's still around, Johnny Ray Youngblood. Bring it, have the Detroit Public Library, bring him in. He's an older man, so I don't know. I don't know exactly.
I understand. Thank you. Thank you so much, Howard. I want to thank you, of course, for this book. I want to thank you for the discussions we had when you were working on it. And I want to thank you for this discussion tonight. And I want to thank the Detroit Public Library for putting this program together and inviting us here, inviting me to talk to you about this book, The Poor Side of Town, and Why We Need It by Howard Husock. Now, we're going to switch over to questions and comments from the audience, but I would like it, I see Christine is back. I would like it if you guys kind of facilitate the questions, and then Howard will respond to them.
Or you can respond. I think.
Or I can respond if it's something.
Right?
Yeah, if it's something that I can respond to, I'll respond. Yes. Thank you, Christine.
One question is, what do you think of the tiny house movement?
I have no problem with the tiny house movement. I don't think it's going to solve the homelessness problem, which is the theory of it. I'm all for tiny houses. I'm all for mobile homes, anything that people can afford. I know in California, it costs like about $70,000 to build one of these tiny homes, so that might seem a little high. I think small homes for people who want to buy small homes, it should be available to them. I think that's a good thing. There's a theory that you're going to move the homeless off the streets into the tiny homes and that'll solve their problems. I don't happen to believe that. I think a lot of street homeless people have other problems, substance abuse and mental illness, and they need treatment, not just shelter.
Now, another question is, what about people that aren't in, or families that aren't inclined to have or interested in home ownership? There's some people that just aren't interested in owning homes. But for example, New York City is probably filled with people or don't have enough money. Like if I was to move to New York tomorrow, I wouldn't be able to afford to buy a condo there in New York City. And I'm a homeowner here in Michigan, though.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Cleveland, and I like to say you can buy 3 houses in Shaker Heights, the most rich neighborhood in Cleveland, for the cost of a parking space in New York. That's not a joke either. That's an accurate fact.
Right.
Well, I think one of the two things, should everybody buy? No, it depends on your situation. Why is housing so expensive in New York? Because supply is constricted by zoning laws and land use laws and all sorts of red tape. So New York is its own special case, which we shouldn't get into because its problems don't resemble Detroit in any way. You got so much open land in Detroit, the need to rehabilitate older homes. Detroit is in a different place. Should people not buy homes? Well, if you have capital and you would prefer to rent because you don't want to have to go to Home Depot all the time and buy all that stuff, if you invest it well, you can be okay. That's a difference between now and 1950. You have a lot of mutual funds that are available to the little guy. you don't have to accumulate capital through home ownership, but it still remains a preferred way. It's a tax advantaged way, and you get to live there too. So that's a double bonus.
Yeah, I want to say that there's no way in the world you're going to have everybody want to be a homeowner. That's just never going to happen. So there are people who just don't want to be homeowners, and there are people who would rather rent and be able to move and pick up without trying to have to sell the home when they get ready to move. There's a lot of people who are mobile, so they may work at this job for a little bit, and then they're moving to a different job, and they're moving to a different job, and they may not want to be juggling trying to sell this home and all of that. So I have no problem with the fact that everybody doesn't want to be homeowners, but the federal government forced people into housing projects who wanted to be homeowners.
Right.
So they didn't give those people a choice. They pushed people into becoming renters who in some cases had been homeowners, but
right.
their neighborhood was destroyed by urban renewal. So they lost their homes, and now they're in a project because the FHA won't back a home loan for them to move into a working class home. So the federal government pushed people into being renters who wanted to be homeowners. And so by that standard, I'm calling that a problem. I'm calling that the federal government created an issue when they pushed people who would rather have been homeowners, some of which were homeowners. They were homeowners, and they became renters because of federal government housing policy. So that's what I'm saying, that just as the federal government created an incentive for people to end up in projects, they could have just as well incentivized home ownership for African Americans. They did incentivize home ownership for whites, for working class whites, but they blocked most, not all, but the overwhelming majority of African Americans who attempted to get FHA-backed loans from the 1930s to 1968. The overwhelming majority of them were prevented from doing so. They were blocked from getting home loans. Many of those people ended up renting. Some of them ended up in projects. Others ended up in two-family flats, renting a flat. Others of them ended up doing what we call what do we call it the owner, I forget the name of it. When the owner still
lease to own.
Yeah, it's kind of like a lease, a rent to own, but it's the owner still owns the house, but you're paying him, and you miss a couple of payments, and he kicks you out.
Oh, land contract.
Land contract. So you can end up with African Americans in those, in which is very exploitive. But these exploitative systems that this is all due to policy. This isn't because people chose to be renters. If everybody had a chance to choose to be a renter or a homeowner,
right,
then we wouldn't have an argument here. But people ended up somewhere because of federal policy.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. They should, in answer to your question, Christine, it should be a choice that's available to everybody. And that not only means that we have to have enforcement of fair housing laws so that anybody who can afford to buy or rent is not prevented from doing that, but we have to have a spectrum of housing types that are built so that people can buy things that are available in their price range.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. It's 7:05, so we're going to end the program. But thanks again for coming to Detroit Public Library. We really appreciate you. To our audience, just want to let you all know that the book is available at Pages Bookstore on the west side of Detroit on Grand River.
Wow.
So go there to buy the book.
The Poor Side of Town and Why We Need It.
Yep.
That's right.
I better plug it, I got to do that.
Of course.
That's right.
But I have to say, Christine, the library looks so beautiful. I'm so bereft that I couldn't come to Detroit and do an in-person event with my man Jamon here. We had such a great conversation, and I regret not meeting both of you in person, and I hope that someday we will get to meet.
Hopefully so. Hopefully so.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Howard. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Detroit Public Library. And thank you all to the audience who all listened to this great conversation today.
Everyone have a good night.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation.
Bye.